All right, so we'll start. Yeah. Yep. So welcome everyone. It's nice to see in person, of course, and online. For those who have joined, I'm seeing out the back. So I begin by acknowledging that we are on unceded Aboriginal land, which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And the ongoing fight against colonization, genocide, and resistance persists here in Palestine and across all colonized lands and lands. So today we are your Christopher Mays, and I'm sure many of you all already know who he is because of works or listening to the podcast of him. But for those who don't know, most of you know through Undisciplinarity, the podcast. Okay, let me walk through that. So Chris is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy, Faculty of Arts and Social Science, and the co-convener of Philosophy and History of Ideas Research Group. And his research interests include history and philosophy of healthcare, sociology of health, food, and bioethics. So I don't want to take much going on about the introduction, I feel like, because there's so much of work you have done, and I'm curious to hear more from you and then the conversation to open up, of course. So over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Sapriya. Thank you for the invitation, and it's nice to be talking among friends. And yeah, so this talk is kind of about conversation and about talking, and it's based, or part of it's based on a article I wrote a little while ago in the special issue that came out around Miles Little, and so part of it will be talking a little bit about Miles and an interview I did with him, as well as Sister Mary Regis Dunn. And this is part of my sort of ongoing history of bioethics in Australia project, which is started in 2017 and is yet to be completed, but hopefully going to have a book come out about that next year. So yeah, this talk is based on these two interviews that I did. So Sister Regis Mary Dunn and Miles, I'll refer to Miles by his first name if you don't mind, just in terms of familiarity. But, you know, they were both, I think, two of the first interviews I did, and they have both since died since conducting those interviews. So Sister Regis Mary Dunn was born in 1926 and died in 2020, and Miles was born in 1933 and died in 2023. And so some of you, I'm going to assume, will be somewhat familiar with Miles and his legacy. Sister Dunn is perhaps less well known, but she established the first cytogenetics diagnostic laboratory in Queensland in 1960. Was one of the first founders of sort of genetic counselling, particularly in Queensland, and was the founding director of the Queensland Bioethics Centre, which was formally established in 1981. And Miles, is a surgeon, founding surgeon, I believe, at Westmead Hospital, and founding director of the Centre for Values, Ethics and Law in Medicine, which was established in 1996, which I'll refer to as Vellum, which I know has since become She, but I'm sort of mainly focusing on Vellum for sort of historical break, if you like. So why focus on these two people and these two centres? Partly, I think, because Sister Dunn and Miles offered this unique perspective into the establishment and then transformation of bioethics communities that offered this possibility for belonging and participation in a more expansive sense than a formal membership to a community or employment in a particular area. So both the Queensland Bioethics Centre and Vellum sought to create and include a community beyond academia. And I think I've written on and published on the formation of the Monash Bioethics Centre, and I think that one of the distinctive features, not to say that they didn't do community engagement, but both of these centres, and especially the Queensland Bioethics Centre, really grew out of sort of a grassroots community activity, I would argue. So I use these two interview fragments to think about the conditions and practices of belonging to a bioethics community, both lay, academic or otherwise, and reflect both beyond Dunn and Little on the ways that temporal, spatial and discursive dynamics open up or foreclose belonging and exclusion. And I'll conclude with some thoughts on undisciplinarity or disciplinarity, partly through a prompt from Sapriya, partly, this isn't just also an extended advertisement for my podcast, but we'll see how we go. But this idea of, role does discipline play? And I would say that within bioethics, there is a certain anxiety about discipline. And how does that play in terms of belonging, particularly among what I will sort of riffing off Miles, this sort of bioethical fragments. But first, I want to just also to appreciate the significance of the conditions and practices of belonging. So why would we need communities of belonging anyway? I think by providing some snippets from other interviews that I did with people reflecting on their careers in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, sort of shows this is just an impressionistic sketch, if you like, of the way some other participants who I interviewed talked about, what I could be referred to as the pre-bioethics world of Australia in the 1960s and 80s. So one person, Bert Clifford, who was the CEO of the Sydney Adventist Hospital from 1968 to 1990, and he established the Centre for Christian Bioethics in 1987 up at Wahroonga, and I would argue has got the largest bioethics library in the Southern Hemisphere. I can talk about that at another time if you like. But this is a quote from him. He says, "I suppose the interest began in the mid-1970s. At that time, there was very little activity in Australia in the hospital industry in ethics. One of our first initiatives, interestingly, was a collection of newspaper clippings, sometimes a cartoon. It was remarkable. It seemed to me that the newspaper were feeding the public with these questions on reproductive technologies and so on, and they were beginning to find their place. And yet, very few hospitals had policies or statements on these questions." So, an interesting aside is that this centre, the Monash Bioethics Centre and the Queensland Bioethics Centre, in looking at their archives, all had big folders of newspaper clippings. It's interesting to me how sort of newspapers were sort of this first archive for at least some of these centres. So that's Bert Clifford. This is a quote from Henry Killam, a long-standing member and participant of Vellum, who also recently died, and he's reflecting on his role as a junior resident in 1965. This is from Henry saying, "Certainly I can remember a lot of ethical things coming, but we didn't call it ethics. We called it anything but ethics. Things like disobeying senior medical staff. One of the things that we thought were absolutely critical were where we thought what they wanted to do, that is the senior staff, was going to kill a patient. And we did something different and then told them about it later, rather than to try to get their permission first, because we knew we wouldn't get it. They were obviously ethical issues for a junior person to embark on something like that." Another quote from William Walters, who was an obstetrician and involved in the development of IVF with the Carl Wood team. He says, "Now, surprisingly enough, human ethics committees weren't established in hospitals until the late 1970s, where there weren't such creatures about at all." I like the way he refers to them as creatures. And then finally, this is a quote from Linda Moore, an embryologist from Queen Victoria Medical Centre, also very much involved in those first period of IVF. And this is a quote from her, not an interview I did with her, but she was in the New York Times in 1984, talking about the orphaned, what were referred to as the orphaned Rios embryos. So I can talk about that at another time, but basically there were these embryos, the parents had died and they didn't know what to do with them. And so in the New York Times, she says, "If the parents die or they are separated or they don't want their embryos, are they my responsibility? Can an embryo inherit things? I don't know what the answers are." So I'm using these quotes to give an impressionistic account, and much more could be said about each of them. And I'm certainly not implying that there was no ethical thought going on. On the contrary, I think this period before the establishment of formal ethics committees, centres, and capital B bioethicists is interesting to see how ethics was, practiced in the wild, if you like. But what is clear is that the discourses, conversations, and authorities were disparate, scattered, and heterogeneous. There was not a sense of where one can have these kinds of conversations. And it's something that also comes up in a lot of the interviews is that they often happen in tea rooms and break rooms and corridors and those sorts of places rather than conferences or seminars or even journal articles. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of move on to an extended quote from Sister Regis, and then an extended quote from Miles, and then some reflections, and then it'll be interesting to have a conversation. Okay, so this section is belonging, spatial, temporal, discursive. Number one, Queensland Bioethics Centre. So just for a bit of context, in 1978, Archbishop Rush, who was the Catholic Archbishop in Queensland, wanted a bioethics centre of some sort, didn't quite know what it was going to look like, in Brisbane. And so he sent Sister Regis to study moral theology at the University of Chicago. You know, the Catholics are good, they just send someone off. You know, she was a scientist and she would go. And she spent time at the Kennedy Institute and wanted to replicate their library. And, you know, maybe, I don't know about the Catholic Church at the moment, but she had $47,000, which she then was able to buy a whole bunch of books in the US because they were cheaper and ship them back to Australia. And so this is where the excerpt starts. So I sent them home by ship, you see. They didn't get home until a week after I arrived, which was good because I asked the Archbishop, now where is this going to be? And he was sort of hoping the Sisters of Mercy could do something. And Sister Angela Mary, she wasn't at all keen to do anything. But there was a house in Clarence Street that was available. So she said, well, we could make this available and you can have it rent-free. So I said this to the Archbishop and he said, oh yeah, that would be good. So that's where it was first set up. So importantly, and I'll come back to this Clarence Street house was right next to the Mater Hospital in Brisbane. And it was at a really significant junction, both for sex work communities, Aboriginal protest sites, as well as being located near a lot of the major hospitals. So it had a lot of traffic. Continuing. And it was just accessible to everybody. And every Thursday night, it was kept open until 9 o'clock. So people who couldn't access it during work time, they could come and use the resources. And we set up a library of journals. So we subscribed to a lot of journals. Most of the finance of the place went into subscription to journals. So it was very, very good library. Then she gets an invitation from a presentation sister to come and talk to these groups. She said, this is all new. She said, would you come out to the sisters and talk about it? So I went out for tea the next night to St. Rita's, to the convent, and they said, oh, look, our parents and friends would love to hear this. So they set up a meeting with the parents and friends. Well, that was the beginning. I then got invited to all the parishes where presentations were and all the parents and friends, and that was the beginning. Of course, what we did was talk about ethics and where this was coming into modern life and where it was associated with not only healthcare, but this developing area now into research. And then it spread. That spread the interest. So they, the sisters and the people who were interested, came in every Wednesday in Lent, and that was the beginning of the ladies group. And what they did, they usually said earlier that what they were interested in, and so I would prepare a talk about this. Then they would all discuss it from their various points of view, and we'd look up anything we wanted to look up. So they got used to using the resources of it. And then the same thing happened with some men who were professionals, and we formed a men's professional group. And they were doctors and lawyers and various professionals, and they used to meet once a month at night time to raise issues that they wanted to discuss from their own points of view. So we had the professional group. Oh, and then we had another workshop. And I always remember Quintin Bryce, if you don't know who she was, she's former Governor General, and mother-in-law of Bill Shorten, and established lawyer. She was teaching law at the university at the time. She was one of the people who came from the Women's Labour group. And then she invited me to come to the Women's Labour, so I joined them. So there was this big outreach expanding the discussions of ethical issues that were arising now in our society, mostly things that were real in Brisbane. So that was one development. And then, of course, I got put on and invited to various committees. That's the end of that section. So now, Miles. Well, the real motivation behind it, this is the setting up his interest in bioethics, was from the industrial action at the time. The recognition that there were a significant number of people who were thinking deeply about these issues, approaching them using very different backgrounds. But what was terrific was that they talked to one another. Of the 6 people who used to meet regularly in the operating theatres on Wednesday for lunch, 4 were religious, 2 were entirely secular, and there was never any tension. They were Catholic, Fundamentalist Baptist, Anglican, I don't know what the other one was, a Methodist. And they got along extraordinarily well, and the interdisciplinarity of their conversations was highly sophisticated. They're bright people. So I came away with a feeling that principle-based ethics was useful but constraining, and I did a sabbatical year or so. Went to Europe and elsewhere. So when I came back, the idea was to try not to replicate what was happening in Europe, because we couldn't. We didn't have the body of people to draw on that they could have. A culture produces different people, but to find a critical mass and recruit them into a core group, as we called it, and then to arrange from that to meet every week. So the discipline would develop and organically develop. And we asked one person each week to bring forth a topic from their main interests. And it was a presentation that said, this is the state of the art, this is how it needs to be deconstructed as a team. So we were very concerned to keep alive a lot of arguments that were seated around apparently motherhood terms like autonomy, liberty, autonomy, equity, in which the people like Gavin Mooney were very, very constructive and helpful. They were very good at deconstructing those terms and putting it out there. So that's how it developed. That's how it started. And then it became clear that people wanted to do PhDs with us. So the tension began to move from what was purely hypothetical discussions that we had into two things. One was teaching the PhD supervisor and supervision, and the other was consulting. So we were encouraging people, government, the university, every university to seek an opinion. And then we could rotate it around the core group and usually produce a report within 2 to 3 weeks. And that was how the name of the place spread around. We did government things. We did a number of inquiries for the legal profession on genetics in the 1990s. Okay, so now I'm going to sort of just provide some reflections on how I think, and I'd be interested afterwards on your own reflections on this, on sort of how temporal, spatial, and discursive dynamics sort of open or foreclose the possibility of belonging in these different communities. So one being time, the temporality, Sister Regis talks about in that, people couldn't access things during work, so they would come at night time, which then also has a gendered dimension to it as well. So the ladies group during the day, this is the 1980s, so there are obviously different dynamics involved in terms of labour and workforce. So ladies group during the day, men's professional group at night. Time also came into play with some of what Miles was talking about with Vellum, so the surgeon's lunch hour, the sabbatical, and I think also there's 2 weeks of turnaround of reports, as well as, who could access these various meetings during the lunch hour. One of the main things that I am interested in is space. So with space with the Queensland Bioethics Centre, as I mentioned earlier, Clarence Street next to the Mater Hospital. So since the mid-1990s, the Mater was questioning this viability of the Queensland Bioethics Centre in its current location in that place. So one of the main sticking points was that the cottage needed repairs to comply with OH&S. And neither the Archdiocese or the Mater wanted to take responsibility to pay for those repairs. And so in November 2007, the Queensland Bioethics Centre moved from that cottage in South Brisbane to the leafy suburbs of Ashgrove. Now, I don't know if you know Brisbane that well, but that's sort of a lot further out and not in that same kind of hospital precinct, or, I guess it'd be like moving from here to the North Shore or something. And so it was located in St Finbarr's Church, and the library continued, but nobody had access to it in the same way. And so it wasn't really used very much, particularly by medical staff or the wider community, until in 2018, the Queensland Bioethics Centre is now located in the Australian Catholic University at Banyo. This move brought the centre into the context of higher education and research. That is quite different from its initial focus on the lay communities and medical staff. In terms of the library, this move also meant that the Bioethics Library has now been enfolded into the general library, and then also to access these things, you need library cards and online journals and subscription, and just the changing dynamics there. Space for Vellum has also changed. I may be wrong, but I believe we're maybe on where it was originally housed in the Blackburn building. Was Blackburn
next door? It's
just
grass now.
Okay, it's just grass now. So that's where that is. But then, the movement to the Medical Foundation building over the road of Parramatta, allowed different access to different communities, as well as prevented some access to different communities here. And, I haven't been part of the move to Edward Ford, but it'd be interesting to see or hear about how that shapes then the kinds of conversations, the kinds of interactions, and the kinds of conversations that are opened or closed through that move. And just on discourses, I think what was really interesting in both of their accounts is this kind of self-generating, particularly with the Queensland Bioethics one, the way that people would bring a topic that concerned them or was of interest to them, and then that would be the way that the conversation would start. And I really like this, and I was only in rereading this quote that sort of this when Sister Regis says, mostly things that were real in Brisbane, like, I think that idea, and as we would know, a lot of bioethical conversation has been critiqued for, what are we going to do about pregnant robots or those sorts of things? Who brings that? Who's actually concerned by that? And where is the interest being generated? But, that idea of, the things that were real in Brisbane, I thought was interesting. As well as these sort of different religious and professional involvements. So both the initial phase of, so in both what Miles had to say and also and obviously being a Catholic institute, there's going to be that religious dimension. And that is going to exclude some people in some ways if they're not part of a particular discursive community. But also, it's not to say that a secularized conversation doesn't also have its own exclusions. So the other, I guess, one of the final things that struck me with both of those accounts is that both the initial phases of Queensland Bioethics Centre and Vellum sort of had this model of kind of doing bioethics rather than sort of what is bioethics. It's more, let's do bioethics in having these different conversations. And so Miles used the phrase organic, and it sort of makes me think of this Grabskian sort of organic intellectual that it's coming from below. So this initial phase in both of them of having these open conversations, but I ended both of the quotes with this formalisation that then happens. So with the Queensland Bioethics Centre, then she gets invited to be on a lot of committees, and then they also take up some responsibility teaching ethics at Griffith University. And then likewise with Vellum, now you've got to train PhDs. Well, you have to train PhDs, you've got to go through, all these different courses and accreditation and the like. And so, it seems that in both cases, there were these different ways to transform from centres as discourse communities to centres as university or institutional apparatuses, and having different perhaps roles, and raising questions such as who is left out, who is included, how do these shifts provide opportunities for new discourses? So it's not to say that it's all bad, but what new possibilities are available and new engagements, but then what's left behind, what's foreclosed. And is it a problem to leave out others? So there is this, sometimes we think inclusivity is a sort of unquestioned good, but, we don't want to include all sorts of things. So, on what basis do we sort of have these inclusion, exclusion criteria? So I guess moving towards a conclusion, sort of the conditions of ethical discourse community is something that Miles talked about, not just in my interview with him, but in this article that I was reflecting on in the special issue that Kate and Claire and Wendy and Ian edited. And so I like this, a good way to stretch. So the conditions of an ethical discourse community. So we can have there's lots of discourse communities. Nazis have a discourse community, but what is an ethical discourse community? And according to Little, Jordans and Sayers in the article that I was reflecting on and wrote a bit about, they characterize it by a repeated interrogation of ideologies and its own ideologies included. And I think that this is a good way to think about it, but it also strikes me as being quite a liberal Enlightenment idea that leaves little room for the sacred, for awe, for trepidation, to approach things with fear and trembling. There is a certain approach to some, and I'm not suggesting Little, Jordans and Sayers are saying this, but there is some kind of we're going to interrogate everything, but if we interrogate everything, what is left? And so they talk about an ethical community would also be creative, so deconstructive and creative. But I think it's worth reflecting on what can be created if we are continually interrogating as well. Okay, so what about today? I think one thing is the community involvement question. I'd say in a lot of academic bioethics, do we have more participants in a sort of formal sense, but less community engaged in a more informal sense? I'm not sure. I also don't think that they need libraries and resources in the same way. So we can't replicate the past. If we were to open up down on, Parramatta Road, a sort of a reading room, people would think we're a cult. I don't think that's certainly the way necessarily to go. I mean, something else that in the article by Little, Jordans and Sayers, they talk about sort of heteroglossia, the idea of multiple multiple talk and multiple voices in the way that can be reduced to a monoglossia, the drawing on Bakhtin. And I do wonder about certain disciplinarity and certain ways that we can, we obviously, discipline can be a good thing. We need to sort of work out a particular language, a particular way of doing things, but then it also poses these problems of cutting out certain other voices, particularly if they're not presented in the way that we like to hear. So in wrapping up, I have two more things. So just on that point of, so I asked Miles, about the state of bioethics today, and he responded saying, I see increasing fragmentation, which he explained as the increase in specialization and expertise within bioethics. He analogized from surgery and saying in the 1950s, everyone was a general surgeon. But starting in the 1970s, people became breast surgeons or liver surgeons or large bowel surgeons. I think the same thing is happening to bioethics. That means it becomes impossible for someone to be a Renaissance bioethicist, to be the one man, and it's, almost usually a man, who has all the answers and principles on hand. They can't really tell you about the details because your epistemological basis of that has to be so much deeper. So a danger of fragmentation in bioethical discourse is that we can only speak in general terms or with an ever narrowing group of other experts and specialists. So how do we sort of bridge that divide between sort of general relevance and fine detailed expertise? Perhaps we need to deliberately seek and cultivate spaces that not only protect against conformity, but enable this heteroglossia, to hear, speak, and think differently, at least for a time. They note in their article that experiences happen to us in our personal space, and they involve change to ourselves and to the things we care about, at least enough to notice. Perhaps the impetus for new and evolving bioethical communities may come from unlikely sources: an industrial dispute, a pandemic, a genocide, a bushfire or a flood, or something more banal that makes us ask ourselves and our peers, why do we act and think that way? And I think part of this is risk, and that's what, in their article, I should provide some link to this article I keep on referring to. They talk about risk, but I think also about surprise is, important, and something unruly and unplanned and unexpected. Like yesterday when I was reading this book by Raymond Gaita, An Uncommon Humanity, and for a completely different reason, but then it, I guess, surprised me, and I want to conclude with it. Surprised me and depressed me because he was reflecting on, in 1998, Noel Pearson called members of the coalition racist scum for the way that they had white-anted the native title policy. And people then sort of had this shock horror, or how come he shouldn't be talking like that? He needs to talk in a civil way to sort of critique these, racist policy. And then it just made me think about present moment, Lydia Thorpe, and the way people are talking about civilized discourse, and was that appropriate or not? And so I just want to conclude with Raymond Gaita. And here he's talking about, this desire for a civilized discourse. The rhetorical force of those questions becomes more powerful when they are directed at our attempts to converse with those whom we or our political ancestors have brutally wronged. If we enter such a conversation with a determined idea of what counts as their civilized forms, then we are bound to shut our ears to what we do not wish to hear. It happens in the personal relationships. It often happens in personal relationships. More often than the injunction, try to be civilized, is a cruel reproach to those who we have hurt, telling them not to make us too uncomfortable by showing their pain. When we then add humiliation to their pain. Martin Buber, I'm never good with that pronunciation, was wiser than this. He said that the basic difference between monologue and the fully valid conversation was the otherness, or more concretely, the moment of surprise. His point is not merely that we must open to hearing surprising things, we must be open to being surprised at the many ways we must justly and humanely relate to one another in a spirit of truthful dialogue. It is in conversation rather than in advance of it that we discover, never alone, but always together. I'll leave it there. But yeah, I think that idea of conversation and surprise, and it's in the context of conversation that we can make these surprising discoveries, is something that little done and, some bioethics communities and dialogues can produce. They can also become ossified, but we got to work out and maintain. Let's stay on the positive, Chris. The surprise. Yeah. So interesting.
Great. Thank you so much. So beautiful way to end with a conversation when we are having this conversation. At the same time, like looking at the larger political context and contextualizing the whole discipline in itself, right? And you brilliantly brought in, especially with Australian bioethics, considering what happened, what's the history, and through different snippets, as I understand, I'm sure you had more there. So I have a couple of questions, but much more to learn more how you think. But before asking me the questions, I thought, like, why are you interested in looking at history of bioethics?
That's a great question. I think so. This is a question that then takes me back to 2016 when I embarked on this project. I think it's part of that. How did the discipline come to be the way that it is?
Why you got interested in looking at the history of bioethics?
Yeah. No, but also, so I guess came into bioethics. I was sort of brought into it by my supervisor moving from, so Catherine Mills was at UNSW. That's when I started doing a PhD with her, not on bioethics as such, and then came into Vellum and then found myself doing bioethics and teaching bioethics. And then it was, I guess, like a lot of my research, like a lot of people's research, it's sort of just an extended sort of therapy session of how did I come to be doing this thing that I'm doing, and how did they come to be doing it as well? So yeah, I'd say that from my own personal, like, what is this thing called bioethics, ripping off the sort of famous philosophy of science book, what is science?
Thanks. That helps to understand like how the anxieties, and then that leads to how do we belong in a disciplinary conversation, which connects idea. So for me, the first thought when I was reading Little Jordan's and Sayers' work, they talk and emphasize about ethical communities, right? And it's more about an antidote or an antipode to discourse communities. That's what the way they were engaging with. So part of me, I was wondering, especially looking from the critical scholarship and critical theories, analysis, much of the work felt little to me as a way of a distance neutral way. But the question of power and the social capital and the way that is navigated within the disciplinary discourse or the discourse communities or ethical communities, I was not sure where that would be interpreted, how they would be, but what did you think about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that that relations of power shape, so I guess coming at this as well from sort of a Foucauldian perspective. So the idea that power is sort of productive in the kinds of things that we think and talk about, as well as I think, I guess trying to think about space and time as well. Like, so who has the time to be engaged in these sorts of questions? And yeah, I would say that another one is that personal motivation. Like, and so often, people are forced to make the time if it's something that affects them personally. But then for people who I guess are doing it more as an academic job, what is directing their interests? So yeah, I think that I didn't get into it in my response to them, but I do think that they certainly shape discourse communities.
And this follows up, I think it is like follows up on the whole next question, which I had is about the larger, the structures which we are living in the neoliberal academic systems, which drives the questions which we want to, which topic or which interest which makes us to go and explore further, and then makes it as a bioethics, disciplinary or not, right? So the ethical communities, right? I mean, it's so nice to have these ethical communities discourse, but at the same time, given the structures, whether it's the bureaucratization, the way the system works in the universities, or whether it's with the capitalist market, which we are because we need to apply for grants, or the kind of topics which is so exotic, or the on-demand kind of topics, and the larger current, the capitalist market of neoliberalism, which in itself plays a role in what discipline of bioethics in itself is seen as or perceived as. So did you come across any thoughts or reflections from scholars touching upon those aspects?
Yeah, so I mean, part of a sort of simple narrative that gains a lot of traction among sociologists for historical, legitimate and illegitimate reasons is that, yeah, bioethics is the product of, it's a late 90s product of neoliberalism, and it's sort of this sort of growth within the university because it's the handmaiden to medical science and all of that sort of stuff. So Roger Cooter is somebody, if you want to read, somebody who sort of really sort of makes those arguments. Nicholas Rose a little bit as well in The Politics of Life Itself. So there is that narrative within sort of sociology and sociology of bioethics. I think what I was trying to do, particularly in interviewing people who are involved in those early stages and sort of doing oral histories with them, and who aren't necessarily these big names, because that's often what as Nicholas Rose, they'll cite the sort of Julian Sedulescu's, Peter Singer's, these people have made, big careers and published lots of books. They'll say, oh, look at these guys, they're sort of riding on the sort of gravy train of, medicine and the like. But there are all these other people who are the sort of, I would say, the bulk of bioethicists. What is motivating them? Why are they getting involved in these kinds of questions? And there certainly is, within the context of, I think, academic institutions, there's ways to sort of, play that game, and there are certain things that generate interest and will get funding, whereas other things won't. And then also with a lot of linkage projects, if you're going to do a linkage with an organisation that has more money, that's going to get up. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying to, I guess, have a more nuanced approach to the way that people, I think, try to work within those systems to, maybe they do get the grant, but they do the other work that they want to be doing, and those sorts of different strategies as well. So
finding the loopholes within the system itself. Yeah. So the last question which I had is what are your ways you feel belonging in this discipline? Or do you call yourself bioethicist?
I've been asked that question quite a lot, and I don't know. The thing that lots of people do, they'll throw, I'm a critical bioethicist. Oh, I'm not like, So look, I am a bioethicist. I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I don't. The reason why I probably don't sort of put my hand on my heart and say that is more, I don't know if the kind of work that I do is that bioethical, rather than I don't want to be associated with bioethics, is more the hesitation.
Yeah.
So I think that, so am I a bioethicist? Yeah, why not?
Yeah. And do you feel, I think it's
maybe we should ask, am I a bioethicist sustainably? I think that
I think you are.
You can do the authoritative speech act that delivering on.
I teach a unit in our master's course, or Kate's taking it on next year. I do it at the moment, called Bioethics in Society, and we have a whole week at the moment called Who is a Bioethicist? And so we talk about this term and its slightly contested nature. And I did a podcast with Lisa Dive, and I came into it ultra skeptical, and Lisa convinced me both that the term is okay and that I should call myself one.
Yeah.
So I've changed my mind about it over the course of my career. I think it was, for me at least, it was a reaction to what's it implying, what's it saying about the field. And I think particularly for me, the place of philosophy in bioethics and the slightly contested nature of that throughout history. So I kind of avoided the term for a long time and used various long-winded things instead. But I'm the same as you now. I'm like, why not? Let's do this.
And I think this is an example of it comes out in conversation. But I would say that another thing, I would want to broaden the category. So one thing that I think is interesting historically, people like Thomas Sars, I know controversial figure, Ivan Illich, Michel Foucault. Why can't they be called bioethicists like that? But they sort of, I think, get put more in that sort of critical health sociology camp. But I think it can be a broader camp.
So the last question, which connects back to, even if we don't want to talk about who is a bio, who is not, because it's kind of in itself a gatekeeping mechanism, I think sometimes. But the reason which I asked is like then the question of ethical communities, right, which we want to create. So the inclusion, the ways we need to bring diverse perspectives, disciplinary orientations. Do you think current bioethics, whatever we call bioethics discipline, is it doing?
What is the
That
current
ethical community space, is it doing it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if there can be such a broad community. Like, you know, where does the conversation happen? Is it the American Journal of Bioethics? I hope not. You know, is it here? Like, I would say, I mean, there comes to a point, and I haven't thought about that. I'd be interested in what, you know, a conversation can't occur at such a grand scale. I don't know, you know, if across, you know, and especially internationally, like, yeah, I make a joke about American Journal of Bioethics, but I find that they're having conversations that sometimes have already happened or are happening extremely differently in other areas of, you know, the bioethics camp. So I don't know if there can be one central.
In Australia?
So in Australia, that's narrowing it down. What is the conversation?
I mean, do people feel one can belong in these communities, being as diverse one can be from disciplinary frameworks?
I would say that, so look, I can't answer that in terms of, you know, everyone else here will have their own opinion. But one thing that I would observe from looking at the history is that there was, it seemed to me, and again, whether people online or elsewhere, people in the 1970s and 80s, there was a sense that no one knew what was going on, and it was in the context of the conversations that bioethics emerged. So in a sense, no one felt that they should belong to anything. Like Helga Kuzer, who I interviewed, she talked about, you know, going to what I believe was one of the first bioethics conferences that was at UNSW, and it was held jointly between community medicine and Catholic college on the campus. You know, she talked about seeing this sea of nuns in habits, you know, at the conference, and she felt an outsider there. Whereas now she, I guess, you know, not that she participates much in the bioethics these days, but you know, her legacy is probably now the norm of that community. And, you know, I don't think I've ever seen a nun in a habit at a bioethics conference. So there's those shifts. So I think that maybe it's a reflection of, there's what I alluded to earlier about this sort of nervousness around disciplinarity and nervousness within a place within the university that does require disciplinarity, that then everyone kind of feels a bit on the outside, I wonder, like, which is it's an interesting thing. Like, when I go to, say, a conference like Arbor, I feel maybe intellectually maybe on the outside, but it's a sort of nice community of people. Like, so it's more sort of seeing people who you know. But yeah, I think that's some waffling on answers.
Okay, let's have Prince Kate and Diego.
Hoji's got his hand. I think he was the first.
Okay, Hoji. I didn't see. Sorry. Hoji?
Hi, Chris. Thank you. So my question is about, so your talk was about how exclusion and inclusion dynamics feature within bioethics community. I'm now trying to take the conversation into how bioethics community is also excluded or included in broader academic environment. So sometimes we bioethicists are being excluded or not adequately included in conversations, partly because it's not clear to others from other disciplines what is our expertise. And I was wondering if in your historical investigation that also came up, that kind of dynamic bioethics community or people in bioethics community in the broader academic environment being excluded.
Thanks. So interesting question. Yeah, and again, I mean, maybe going back to this previous question, I guess because not many of the people who I was interviewing sort of would have referred to themselves as bioethicists because that kind of label didn't really exist in the same way. So, you know, Sister Dunn, she was a cytogeneticist and scientist who then started, so a lot of these people were coming, Miles as well, would be coming from a profession and then getting trained up in some ethics and then going into it. And I guess we're in a different period where people can do a degree in bioethics and then come into these conversations, which, yeah, as you say, some people find that hard to know where we fit, because what do we bring? Which then may bring up the sort of philosopher. People seem to have some sense of what the philosopher does. Some people don't, and philosophers themselves, but there's a sort of clearer sort of foothold rather than social scientists. No, that doesn't really answer your question.
Okay, this isn't really a well-formed question or anything like that, but I thought it was really interesting the way that the two people you interviewed have such different I guess discourses, really. So Miles setting up Vellum inside the University of Sydney, you're surrounded by the academic discourse, and doing bioethics in this academic space in an academic way brings it into, I guess, the sort of areas of legitimacy or something like that, like gives some sort of extra heft to the language that's developed in the conversations that are happening, so that you get to set agendas and do things like that. Where I feel like the bioethics that was happening with Sister Dunn is, she said, like, the real problems of Brisbane, but it's like, it's a bioethics that doesn't end up getting the same sort of acknowledgement. It doesn't get to set the agenda in the same way. And it's really interesting to me because we were talking about this actually in our seminar on Tuesday, the way that some of the organizations that are paying most attention to the so-called diseases of the bottom billion are charitable organizations and that kind of thing. Like, they're not really empowered to set agendas in the way that the academy is setting agendas, yet who's doing the more important bioethical work there?
Yeah.
And how does the ability to create kind of like a word, somehow like an intellectualized language, ends up becoming a tool to wield all sorts of other powers and influences or something like that. So it's really just a reflection on what you were saying.
Yeah, and I'd only add to that, like, I think just the changes as well within academia, like that Vellum used to have these, I don't know if they were annual, but you probably, I don't know, still seen them around, those things like the Cancer Survivor, and then self-publish these little pamphlets and those sorts of things. Whereas the idea now to get academics together, even us, and we're going to have a workshop, and then we're going to self-publish this work in this little pamphlet, and we'd be like, well, no, it needs to be in a Q1 publication. I've got to get it through peer review, and there's no way I'm going to put my time and effort into something like that, because if I don't, then I get no, as much as we would like to do those things, but those metrics have really shifted and changed, even within academia. But I hear what you're saying as well about the bioethics, grassroots bioethics, or however we want to bioethics from below.
I want to ask you, so I guess I'll preface this by saying, I think the whole debate around what is bioethics is a bit of a mug's game, and kind of bristle against it. So the reason I'm saying that is because I actually want to pick up on the last thing Kate mentioned, which stood out. You mentioned the location of where Sister Dunn's original library was, and meeting center was around where there was sex workers and a lot of people who I would argue are probably marginalized, for lack of a better description. And they were doing real world problems. I can't remember exactly how you noted it. So did that include things that we would now normally put in the bucket of public health ethics?
Maybe. I wouldn't know. I mean, I would need to go back and look at maybe.
I guess the reason I'm asking that is because I guess this goes back, you mentioned this point a moment ago, which is people wouldn't necessarily call themselves bioethicists if they were a surgeon or whatever the case might be. I'm wondering whether what we think are sub-disciplines have actually always been there from the very beginning,
definitely.
right?
Yeah.
That we just didn't call them public health ethics,
Yeah.
right? But it's always been on the table. We've
Yeah.
always had public health ethicists. So I was just wondering, again, whether you had kind of actual evidence in your interviews of that.
Yeah. Of like referring to things as public health ethics or referring to things.
Referring to the topics that we would now normally categorize as public health ethics or
Yeah,
outside
definitely.
of.
Like, so another guy
Yeah.
who and a different person who well, yeah, firstly, like looking back at those folders of all the newspaper articles, that sort of also gives an indication.
Right,
They were really,
right.
and especially the Catholic one, you know, there was a whole folder on masturbation. You know, that was a sort of health ethical issue that needed to get.
There's a great Onion article about masturbation in the church too, but yeah.
But yeah, someone else was talking a lot about and this was a theologian and pastor talking about how they done a lot of work with air pollution in their local parish and community, and you know the high rate of kids with asthma in their community, and they sort of saw that as part of. And it's interesting as well, like just going back to these sort of definitional, and I agree it's a mixed game because a lot of people would say, especially when I approach them to interview, they'd say, I'm not really a bioethicist, so you know, I don't know why you want to interview me. And I was like, well, you know, let's talk about it and see you know what happens.
Yeah, the increasing professionalization of this discipline, like with masters, with the degrees, leads to much more of who is not and who is not. It's kind of that, I think, well, that's just a thought, like why this question in itself becomes a challenge sometimes when you submit to a certain journal. No, this is not bioethics paper. Like what?
Yeah.
Now, if you're questioning on one hand, it's quite this, inclusive, and we need to bring the diverse perspectives, then there is something gatekeeping happening in this academic discourse too, right? So that's the question I was thinking.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to hear other. But yeah,
I guess I have one thing to say about that before my completely different question. It makes me think that perhaps there's an obligation to call yourself a bioethicist if you are bringing a diverse perspective, because that's the only way that bioethics will become more diverse, less medically attached. But my actual question is, are there other disciplines that you think are having ethical conversations in the spaces like this, or I guess less academically? I don't know, social work or something?
Less academically.
Ideally.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would not want to sort of judge the merits of the ethical thought in other disciplines. But yeah, like, I mean, in in anthropology, there's a lot of people talking, the moral turn or the ethical turn, so there was a sort of sections of anthropology who are like, we just describe things that are out there, and, but there's a big movement to say that no, we aren't just describing things for the mining industry to know whether this is a sacred site. But yeah, so there's a lot in anthropology and sociology, like where they are taking a particular normative dimension to their research, and social work as well. And all of these disciplines, and bioethics is no exception, have been part of those powers and the sort of powers of capital and government, in particular in terms of racial politics, dispossession, all of that sort of stuff that I think we need to wrestle with as a discipline too, if we are sort of being attached to that. So yeah, something like anthropology or social work. I mean, social work is what made me think of that. We talk of stolen generations, as we should, but that involved social workers and public health practitioners, and likewise it provided ethical arguments and justifications for those interventions. They weren't nasty, mean people; they were ethical people doing the right thing. So that's, I think, also what we need to be, I guess, with our discourse communities. What is heard and what isn't heard. So I guess again with Foucault, he talked about the said and the unsaid is part of discourse as well. So what's not said and what objects are part of that is also important.
Are there any of those disciplines that are doing more of the grassroots, open up the shop down in Parramatta Road kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there would be. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in how much, and this is beyond what I've looked at, but so this is just mine. But with the academic disciplining across the board of things like participatory research, action input of those sort of things. You know, they go through ethics committees and the like these days, and they become a formalized program. And so then you have, you know, even, and Supriya, you may be able to comment on this, you know, even though we might like to think of them as co-creators, co-designers, they're participants, and, you know, they may go on a paper, but, you know, they're not going to be collecting your salary or those sorts of things. So I think that's part of that challenge as well. Like, how much from within the academy can you do that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I have a question that's kind of connected, I guess, to this question of space that you have, because I was thinking about, I can't remember how you put it, but I guess I was thinking about it in terms of affordances. And I know that I'm borrowing that language from somewhere, but I can't remember where.
And not, but
yeah. But it's like
take it and do with it.
Yeah, exactly. But when, again, I'm sort of thinking about Miles and Sister Dunn, or Miles and his team here, who were all medics, were preoccupied with the kinds of problems that would arrive at their doorstep, which were extremely clinical in nature. Whereas the ones that Sister Dunn and her sisters were focused on were the ones that arrived on their doorstep were extremely mundane: population health, infection, poverty, sorts of things. And it's like, so what kinds of, how does the environment in which they were operating afford a completely different perspective on what a field like bioethics should even be focused on, or what it can achieve, or I feel like clinical ethics took over so fast and kind of at the expense of these other problems. And it's really interesting to just sort of like reflect on how that happened. I keep coming back to the fact that it happened in a university. That just seems so central to the question of like who even has time or access to the kinds of like publication machinery to put out a self-published pamphlet or something like that.
Yeah. And I think just sort of picking up on that, like the gender, class, race issues that go into, you know, who is in the university, not only just whose voices are heard, but who actually gets through the degrees. You know, we were talking about this on the way here, you know, medicine is lots of research on the sort of very narrow sort of socioeconomic background of people who end up in medicine and their life experiences, and what they would know from their own life is, and similarly with philosophy. So someone who I've been reading a lot lately, Mary Midgley, and you know, some of her work about gender and the kinds of, you know, and her work, you know, I think one thing that bioethics share with her is, you know, being dismissed as not philosophy, not proper philosophy. So Mary Midgley, in talking about, you know, and cataloguing how many of the successful male philosophers are childless, you know, and not married, and that gives you a whole different perspective on time and the world and connection to other people. And I was also, and I guess relatedly, Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. I brought that, we had a university meeting about space and we're going to get rid of our offices, and I brought that up, but I don't think they were particularly interested. But you know, these kinds of like the material, spatial, economic dimensions.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting. I found it super interesting to learn the enormous role that Penny played in helping Miles be able to set up his surgery department at Westmead. So Penny is Miles's wife, and she and the other wives ran lunches. They organized evenings with the presidents of the hospitals. They had loads and loads to do. It was a completely different time. I believe the Westmead surgery thing was set up in the late 60s, something like that. And so society was organized in a different way to how it is now, mostly. But yeah, there was a ton of women's work going into the background, while the great men were achieving these these things.
Yeah, Peter Singer's mother was really involved in the early stages of the Monash Bioethics Centre. And a lot of people I interviewed associated with that would talk a lot about how she sort of, really sort of did a lot of that work as
It's
well.
fascinating.
Yeah.
And lived experience, right? Going back, like how one's lived experiences, context, as you said, like
Yeah.
plays huge role in what we think and why. I think ethical communities is about reflection, critical. But at the
Yeah.
same time, how we sometimes miss out the structures which is playing in and then goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Thanks, Chris. And
Thank you,
for those
Chris.
who are here, let's go for lunch.
Yeah.
Sorry, very nice.
Super interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. You should write a book about Penny and
you. Yeah, a bit like.
Penny Singer's mom.